Now, before we jump too deeply into design patterns, let's take a few minutes to level set on objects in JavaScript. Now, if you've been doing JavaScript for a while, this may be a little bit rudimentary for you, but it's important we take a few minutes and level set everybody to make sure we're all on the same page. If we're covering stuff that you already know, it's perfectly okay to just skip to the next module and dig right in on design patterns. But if you're not quite sure what the different ways to create objects are, or how inheritance in JavaScript works, or define properties, or those types of things, hang out with us for a little bit. We'll walk through all of that stuff and get you ready to jump into the design patterns piece of this course. Now, the first piece of this is creating objects. So we just want to create a new object in JavaScript. The simple way is just to use curly braces. Var object equals curly brace, curly brace. And a lot of times you won't see it this way. You'll put stuff in the middle of that, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But this gives you just a clean, simple, one-off object that you can use to do whatever you want with. The next way is object.create. Object.create is going to take whatever you pass in, and so in this case, we're just passing object prototype, and it's going to wrap that in an object and hand you back the object. Now, this a lot of times is going to be used when we start talking about inheritance. This is how we're going to do inheritance in JavaScript. We're going to create an object, then pass it in. The last way we're going to talk about is the new object. Now, the new object's gotten quite a bit of slack, actually, and is a little out of favor, and I'm going to encourage you not to buy into the hype. Especially in ES6, we start to have the class operator that allows us to do true classes, so the new object really isn't as bad as some people are making it out to be. It's okay, and we're going to use it fairly extensively in this course in the right way and doing the right things. So new object just creates a new empty object. This is the 3 ways that we're going to use to create new objects. Now that we have objects, we need to assign some keys and some values to those objects. The first way is to use dot notation. So in this case, I create an empty object using the curly braces, and then I add object.param. Using the dot notation, I can add a parameter and assign that, in this case, new value. So I'm assigning a string to a parameter using dot notation. And then using dot notation, again, I can get access to that. In this case, we're just going to log it out to the screen, object.param, and that's going to write out new value. An alternative to this is using square bracket notation. So in this case, once again, we create the empty object, and then using bracket notation, I'm assigning new value to the parameter param. Then I can get access to that parameter again using the same bracket notation. Now these two are interchangeable, so I can assign with bracket notation and I can pull the value out using dot notation or vice versa, and either way. One of the advantages of using bracket notation, sometimes, not always, is that you can use bracket notation using variables. So in this case, I'm creating a new object, and then I'm creating a variable, a string, just a string variable called value, and I can use that in bracket notation to get access to my new value. So in this case, I'm using the string val with value to assign new value into my object. And then I can use bracket notation to pull it back out again. Now, the advantage of this is if you're not sure exactly what's in that object, and you can use variables to store things and pull things back out. All right, so for this course, we are going to be creating a task application. That seems to be the generic thing everybody wants to create, just a task management application. So the first demo we're going to do is we're actually going to create a task object using all 3 of the examples we just used one by one, so we can kind of see the differences of them and how they work. So we're going to run this demo in Node, and if you don't have Node, that's fine. You can download it and install it now. I'm using 4.2. There's a 5.x version out right now, I'm sure. They're all pretty much the same for the purposes of what we're doing. So in this case, we've got a task.js, and we are going to create a task object. So var task equals open close curly braces. Now, a task should have a couple different parameters on it. So let's do task.title. We'll do task.description. And let's just leave it at that for right now. So if I do a CL, console.log on task.title, okay, using task.js, you can see we're spitting out my task. So I've got an object created, I've added things to that object, and I'm pulling things back out again. If I change this to my object.create using object.prototype, you'll see we get the same result. Those are the two basic ways to create this. Now, what I can also do and put in here is a function. So I can do task.toString equals a function. And I can actually have that return this .title. And then I change this to toString, save that. You see now I get my task. Now I could do my title, this .description, and now you see I get my task, my description. So here I've got an object. I've got two parameters. I've got a function, all encapsulated, all in one thing. And the this, in this case, refers back to my task object. So this always refers to the scope of where it's called. And in this case, it's inside object, my task object. So that's why I get title and description. Now, the last way we're going to just show you real quick is the new object. Same thing, all same work. See, they just all are interchangeable for right now. And in a lot of cases, for what we're doing, you're just going to do curly braces. And I can actually add in here title and description right inside the curly braces. Title and description. Get rid of all that. If I run it, same thing. So that's creating an object and adding things to and pulling things from that object. Pretty straightforward. There's a good chance if you've been doing JavaScript for any length of time, you kind of know all this stuff already. But let's move over and do something a little bit different so that we can start to stretch our object creation just a little bit. Now, sometimes we need a little bit more granular control over these properties that are sitting on our objects. And in ECMAScript 5, we got define property, which is a method on object that allows us to configure our properties to meet some criteria. So in this case, here we are defining property name on object, and then that allows us to configure that property name. We can set the value to my name. We can set whether or not that's writable, which means I can create constants. So something that can't be changed. Enumerable means either in a for-in loop or if I do the keys function, then it will show up or it won't show up. And configurable means I'm not allowed to change the configuration of these items. So once I've set it, I'm not allowed to set it again to something different. So let's take a minute and look at that so we can see kind of what that means. So let's take a look at define property and what the implications are of each of these configuration items that we have and why we might use define property on our objects. All right, so here we've got our task object that we created in the last demo. And basically it's just a title and description. And then we've got a function toString that returns the title and then the description on it. Now, if we convert this over to be object.defineProperty, I can add this toString this way. So we're going to pass in task and then the name of the property we're adding. And in this case, we're adding toString. And then the last parameter to this method is a JSON object. Let's clean this up. All right, so here's what we got. We got value. And in this case, the value is just going to be the function because we're adding that function to task. Now we add the three parameters. We've got writable. We'll make that true. We've got enumerable, also true. And we've got configurable. And we'll set all three of them to true for right now. All right, now, as of this moment, everything should just work exactly the same way. And we can pop over here and do our node and see we're still getting our toString with the my title and my description. That's what we've got right here. This.title, this.description. Now, let's talk about why we might do some of these things. One thing that's very annoying about JavaScript is that everything is assignable. So if I say task.toString equals hi, I have now broken task because toString is now equal to hi. So when I run this now, everything breaks because toString is no longer a function. toString is now this thing hi. So what readable lets us do is prevent that from happening. We set this particular property to false for readable, and that means that you can't accidentally or inadvertently overwrite this property later. So now if I run this, it's going to work. Now, in fairness, I did not get an error. Nothing bubbled up. So be careful, but I would rather not have my function overwritten than to have something weird happen. All right, now let's look at enumerable. If I just do a console.log on task, I see title, description, and then my toString function. And that doesn't look clean. Or I can even do object.keys on task, and I get title, description, and toString. Now in this case, I don't want toString to show up in that way. I want, when you just do a CL on my task, I just want to see title and description. I want to hide that toString from everybody else. So I can set enumerable to false. And now when I run this, now I just get title and description. So that's where those two things come in. If configurable is set to true, I can come back in later. This one is not as important as the other two. I can come back in later and redefine. So if I go object.defineProperty, task, toString, I can set enumerable equal to true. And now when I run it, notice toString is there. And that's not behavior I necessarily want. I don't necessarily want somebody to be able to come in. If I set enumerable to false, I don't want somebody to be able to come in and set it to true. So I keep configurable as false. And then I get an error. This actually throws an error. Cannot redefine property. It says, hold on, you can't do that because configurable has been set to false. Now, as we kind of talked about already, we can use the object.create method for inheritance. We can at least mimic inheritance for right now using object.create. So let's take a look at how we do that with the task object we already have created. So right now we have a task and our define property with a toString. We'll get rid of that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create an urgent task. And that's going to inherit from task. So we'll do an object.create and we'll pass it in task. Now urgent task now is essentially task. Everything's the same. If we copy this though, and we change task now to urgent task, we change this to is urgent, and then we're going to console.log urgent task. All right, so let's run this. And there you go. My title is urgent. Now you know this is a new thing, and we've actually created a new object because I was able to change the toString on urgent task. I wasn't able to change it on task because notice we set readable to false on the toString for task. But when we created urgent task, now it's something new and I can change that. All right, now that we've done a quick level set on objects and how objects work in JavaScript, we can move on to the design patterns. But just a quick recap, we talked about 3 different ways to create objects. We had just curly braces, we had object.create, and then the new keyword. We talked about assigning and reading values using dot notation and the bracket notation. We talked about define properties, object.defineProperty, and the different options surrounding that. And then we talked real quick about inheritance, and we'll talk more about all of these as we work through the rest of this course. Now let's actually dig into some creational design patterns, and we can talk about creating objects.